Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this next tutorial about how to paint this resin guy from Black Powder Red Earth tabletop game. In the last video we tackled how to build these, and I've prepped two of them, but I will show you my painting process on this guy. For the whole endeavor, I primed him with a rattle can in black, and I now will go over that base coat with a thin layer of Abaddon black or something similar. I go here for a satin finish, and I take a rather large brush because I do not want to take too much time. I only go, or I do not go super wet, and I do not go right out of the pot. I try to hit just the right consistency of paint so that I get a thin, even coat, and so that I fill up all the areas that the rattle can didn't get fully. The satin finish of that black also gives me a nice overview later to where to place my highlights. The black you can see here is actually the Vallejo Mecha satin, and it's quite glossy. The Chaos Black will leave you with a slightly more matte finish. Next will be dry brushing with Dawnstone up to Corex White, and you already have seen the big dry brush I used here. We'll start with Dawnstone first to get out all the highlights on the miniature without having to edge highlight every part of it. The trick here is to, for once, use a big brush, and for the second, get rid of most of the paint. Also, whenever you do a dry brush, also do a dry brush before, either on the edge of your painting handle or on the base, so that you get the majority of the pigments out of your brush. Then I start from top to bottom, working on those areas first and longest that will have the most highlights, or where I want the most highlights. While focusing on one direction at the beginning, I also try to get all the edges from below, simply to accentuate all the areas and to have all the details pop later. While less is more, go for 2 or 3 layers. And yeah, the trick is to get really not much paint onto the edges, to get them highlighted without covering the area around, and slowly building up the volume of this. Also note that your brush needs to be dry, so don't wash it out in your paint water during the whole process of painting this miniature. And if you clean it up, leave it at least for a day or two, or try on a paper towel that it's definitely not wet when you approach this. There are also some paints that come out super chalky when dry brushing, and I try to avoid that. So that's good so far as I would go. I won't clean that brush because we will need it later, and so far I'm quite happy with the result. Next are base colors. I'm using a skin tone and a darker red and a darker blue from Games Workshop here, and a middle-sized brush from Red Grass Games. This gives me good coverage, and I can dilute the paints accordingly, so that I color the areas that I want to work on, but I also do not obscure my dry brushed edge highlights. I'll show you on the palette what consistency we want here. The wet palette really helps here. You can of course go for dry palette too, but this will mean that you have to manage your paint more closely and throughout the whole process. So as you have seen, the paint is rather diluted here, and it's more like a wash or a glaze even. And depending on the color you use or the range of paint you use, you may need 2 or 3 layers, or sometimes even 1 layer can be sufficient. If you overdo this step and say overpaint the dry brushed edges, that's no problem, as we can always go back in with the dry brush and get the edges highlighted, get the color a bit bright, a bit lighter, and then adjust by going back in with the blue. It's also mandatory here that you give each layer a certain time to dry, so that you do not wipe off the pigments of the first layer when going over the miniature with your second one. Once we have the, say, first 2 layers down, I'll switch to another color and leave the trousers to dry. Depending on what color you use for the skin tones, you may need more than 2 or 3 layers, especially when you're going directly on black, as I do here. You could go with a brown tone or something similar, especially when you're doing more than 1 miniature, like doing the whole squad. You can vary skin tones a little bit. I also mentioned that I'm going for a darker red in the beginning. That's because I want a nice transition. Later we will go upwards to a lighter red later. Basically, I start with a darker color and then work my way up. If you plan to use mostly washes or inks on your miniature, you might want to go for a lighter color, for lighter red or blue respectively, depending on what wash or ink you want to use. For a more realistic look, I leave some of the paint to pool in the recesses as a fold, or a fold may be in canvas or skin, would catch actually more light. Note that this works contrary to what you usually see when you go for light edge highlights and then use a wash to darken the recesses. That helps in a few places, but especially on skin and on cloth, it works contrary to what your eyes would see as real or correct. I'm now adding a second layer of the blue to the back of the jeans and to areas where the light won't catch too heavily, but I'm not super realistic about the color placement here. I mainly see what looks best. And here I go for another layer of skin tone, and as you see, I push the pigments, push the paint into the recesses so that I get a natural highlight there. We can always correct this later. Now I use Abaddon Black on the gun and all the technical areas that I want to have black, and I go with the same diluted mix as I have shown you on the wet palette before. And I could go over the whole area like you would do with a wash, but I focus on the bigger stages, on the bigger areas, and simply paint inside my dry brushed edges. This would take too long on the helmet and on the full body of the gun, so I go for a glaze wash consistency here, and that tones down our highlights and gives the whole area a bit more depth. Next I paint the satchels and backpack with a drab brown. In this case it's Steel Legion drab from Games Workshop. Sorry for not showing it properly. I'm still going rather thin, but not as thin as with the red shirt and the blue jeans, as I want a little bit of more coverage here. And the plan is to get more contrast into these areas and do that in a slightly different way than we will do on the cloth and the jeans. It would make sense if you paint the full squad of 10 to have a bigger brush at hand, especially for the backpack, to add to the detailed brush and save some time. But here I rather enjoyed using a smaller brush to add in the layers of brown to all those satchels and bags and stuff. Here it's also okay when the pigment of the paint pools in the recesses, and we can then go over the higher areas with a second layer, or we can dry brush the whole area and thus blend our brown with brighter highlights. We also could dry brush later with a brown to get everything together, so to say. So I now add graysea or any light gray to all my base colors, and then start with the first layer of highlights. With the red tone, this can look pinkish or a little bit off, and when we have it on the miniature, we will see how it looks, and we can tone that down or adjust it later at any time. The thing here is, especially on the jeans, as I want a rather worn out look, I do not go in a thick layer or adding a layer of highlights, but I again use the color, the paint as a wash or a glaze, so that it accumulates in the recesses and will leave more like a stain on the surface rather than a consistent layer of pigments. I repeat this in areas where the light would catch the most, as usual, mainly the top of the hind leg and front leg, stuff like that. But I try to get a little bit of the lighter blue pigments all over the place. It's good here to leave the miniature to dry for a while, switch to another area maybe, so you can see later how things work. Now accentuate the skin area, and while trying to be realistic and trying to catch the light source correctly, or going mainly from the top, I'm not super neat here. I again try to push the pigments into the recesses, but I'm only defining the top part of this, and I will come back later to glaze down the more shadowy parts of the arms. So at this stage they might look odd, or they might look too shiny or too light, but once the miniature is dry and once we have added the last steps, this will look differently. As the same as with the shirt, the gray that we add to the say wine red, it's the Galvoback red, is rather dull, and I adjust here directly with the pure Galvoback red to get a little bit more color in. What you can do is stay with the gray and have a rather washed out dark red, or you can push the gray contrast and then later glaze in with the brighter red. Next, our miniature will have a rendezvous with Mornfang Brown or any other mid-tone reddish brown, and we go super thin here by adding loads of water until we have consistency where you can see through the colors and where you can see the pigments. I'm putting this on the base first to give it a sandy look, as the more we dilute acrylic paints, the more matte will the finish be later. And while I'm going only over the shoes and the lower legs here, you will see quite soon that I will cover the whole miniature in the stuff. This needs a bit of practice and experience, so I recommend to go rather a little bit thinner, and if you're unsure, don't leave too much of the pigments pooling around, but you will shortly notice that even if it looks much on the miniature, it won't look that heavy once it's dry. The whole process will tone down all the colors and also blend them rather together and give the whole miniature a matte sandy tone. Don't be afraid of going in with your finger to wipe off the wash or glaze, or however you want to call it, where you don't want it. So after half an hour, the miniature should be dry, and you see that it has a very drab quality. And we now push the contrast and the details out by dry brushing again. I used the same brush with which I have dry brushed the miniature before. The paint is ultra dry and there's almost no paint at all in the bristles, and I use it very carefully here to realign and to re-establish all the edge highlights where I want it. Thus you can define areas of interest. The more you stay in one area and the more you go over it, the brighter it will be. And don't fear, it can happen that paint will peel off, especially when the miniature hasn't dried enough, but we will fix that later. So here on the base you can see the dried first layer, and I go in with Mornfang Brown out of the pot and then do a wet blend by just adding water to the base and brushing the pigments on the base back and forth to get the natural sandy look to it. I also now pick up the Steel Legion Drab again to roughly paint some areas around these rocks, and then once again go in with a watered brush to wet blend the whole area. Again, what looks quite heavy while it's wet will look much more drab and down colored once it's dry, so keep on layering up the stuff until it's like you want it. And now let's go in with some red. I've tested the consistency on the side of the base so that I'm sure that the paint behaves like I want. Here I want a kind of glaze, but I want also to have control over the pigments. I do not want them to pool around too much, but I also do not want them to cover heavily. Here's a mix of the skin tone I used with black, and I'm now going in to the darker areas of the arm. I tried and failed to establish some hairy texture here, but in the end it's also good for the shadows in that area, and yeah, if that happens you can simply go over it with your skin tone and do it again. Tackling the red again with almost no dilution here. I paint in the how is it called, the spectacles. And what I do not want here is the pigments to leave the area where I want to paint, so I go rather directly out of the pot so that I have full control and good coverage, because I do not want to put more layers than needed down there. Using Games Workshop's Gore-Grunter Fur contrast paint, we will add more contrast to the backpack and ammo pouches. I'm going with 1 part contrast paint and 2 parts water here. You can, however, dilute it more and have several layers, or use it right out of the pot and push it around on the miniature as you like. There are various ways to mix your own contrast paints, but I usually go the easiest way, using a finished and proofed product. I go all over these areas here. The same with the Morphing Brown wash. You will see the full effect only once it's dry, and in some areas I go and wipe away the stuff with my finger, pretty much like you would do with animal washes. Last but not least, I paint that little antenna pure black. That part is usually made of matte material, and the slightly satin finish of Abaddon Black will highlight this detail itself, so to say. I'm letting the surface of the paint work for itself. I also pick out the grip of the gun and add a little bit of water to wash down the stark contrasty dry brush on the helmet and on some areas of the gun. But this isn't a mandatory step, you can do as you like. It's just to neaten up some areas and to have a clear line here and there, and to dilute the possible grainy effect of the dry brush. So that's very much it. I hope you could follow the process until here. This video only covers the painting up to this stage, which will give you a good tabletop standard. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. As I do not want to draw this into unnecessary length, I will go no further with painting this guy in this video. I know you probably are all in here for this, which is a much more detailed and realistic version. I will cover that in a second video, and you will see that it's quite easy to go from here, which is already a good tabletop standard, to this rather more realistic version of these fantastic miniatures. So, see you soon. Be excellent to each other. Is this actually a post-credit scene when we have no credits? No? Well then. Cheerio.